Hello and welcome to the Gamecraft Podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Lasky.
I'm Blake Robbins.
And this is a podcast about the modern history of the video game business. Episode 7, The Failures and Future of Virtual Reality.
The predictable hype cycles of the metaverse. Mitch, you're one of the only industry veterans that I've talked to over the years that has been consistently skeptical of VR. And it's interesting because I actually think this lens isn't just like a current Facebook Oculus lens. It's actually a very historical lens. You've talked about this briefly on another podcast, but I think it'd be interesting to just start there. Like, where does this lens come from?
So in 1989, I went to a party in Beechwood Canyon, which is, or at least was, this bohemian neighborhood under the Hollywood sign in Los Angeles. The host was a local artist and software designer, and the guests were people from what was then this fringe subculture of digital artists and game designers in Los Angeles. And as I walked through the living room, the host came over to greet me, and she said that she wanted to introduce me to someone. So she took my arm and she led me outside to the back patio and approached this familiar-looking old man who was sitting alone in a lawn chair with a drink. And she said, "Mitch, meet Timothy Leary. He wants to talk to you about virtual reality." Now, the late 80s was a weird time in technology culture. The launch of the IBM PC and the Apple Macintosh in the earlier 80s had sparked this personal computing revolution, and almost simultaneously, this group of authors, filmmakers, performance artists, and wannabe revolutionaries started exploring ideas about the human implications of the world they assumed, and it turns out correctly, would be mediated by computing technologies. In 1982, Ridley Scott directed Blade Runner based on Philip K. Dick's novel about artificial humans. It was the first of 14 adaptations of Philip K. Dick's work in Hollywood. And Dick's themes of human simulation and the perception of the world shifting underneath you as you weren't sure what was real and what was simulation really resonated with this new group of intellectuals who were confronting this idea of computing. And in 1984, William Gibson, who we'll talk about a lot in this episode, he took this sort of concept of cybernetics from academia and this street aesthetic of punk, and he slammed them together into this thing that we know of today as cyberpunk. And his novel Neuromancer came out in 1984, popularizing this idea of this globe-spanning virtual reality data network that he called cyberspace. Now, there were other strands of this techno subculture that were operating at the same time. There were early hackers and phone freaks. There was the junkyard heavy metal performance art of Mark Pauline's Survival Research Labs, where he'd literally rig like rocket launchers on shopping carts and have them battle in supermarket parking lots. Stellark was building these human machine art installations. The modern primitives movement was advancing body modification, and there were experiments with smart drugs. All this was being hyped in these pre-internet zines, if you were around at the time, like 2600, Mondo 2000, Boing Boing, and the research publications. It was this crazy subculture that connected the MIT Media Lab, art punks, San Francisco post-hippie whole earth catalog freaks, and science fiction authors, all through this shared interest in the human experience of technology. So in this cultural milieu, it didn't seem weird at all in 1989 when my host at that party in the Hollywood Hills walked me out onto the back patio and introduced me to 60s acid guru Timothy Leary to talk about virtual reality.
For me, I probably underestimate the impact that science fiction books had at that time, mainly because the media that I consumed as a kid was not really around that stuff. But for you, I imagine that was just such a huge part of the culture. Maybe just some context of what does Timothy Leary even know about virtual reality? Did he start a VR company?
So Leary had become enamored with computers after he got released from prison in the 1970s, where he'd been serving drug charges. He started speaking publicly about PCs being the new LSD. He'd met this guy, Jaron Lanier, who was the CEO of this company called VPL. And it was one of the pioneering companies from this first wave of VR, this 80s wave of VR. Lanier, interestingly, had come out of the Atari Research Labs that the legendary Alan Kay, who is a shadow behind a lot of what happened in the early days of computing, Alan Kay had set up these Atari Research Labs on behalf of Nolan Bushnell, the CEO of Atari, back in the 80s. And a lot of really, really interesting and future-looking people came through those labs. One of them was this guy, Jaron Lanier, and Lanier had worked on visual programming languages in the K labs. He got enamored with virtual reality, and he decided to start really the first serious company that would make an attempt to build a virtual reality device.
What was the actual product? I mean, that's so early. In the 1980s, we don't have in-home PCs or anything like that at that point. So what were they actually building?
Yeah, I mean, you think about it, it's like making the comparison to the desktop era. We're only 4 or 5 years from the release of the Macintosh. And he's really going to make an attempt at virtual reality, something which even with today's, million times more powerful computers would be challenging. So he builds a head-mounted display. He builds a glove controller that allows for gestural interface, and he builds a haptic bodysuit to provide feedback to your body. You ask, did I try it? It's like trying it meant going to a facility and basically hooking up 5 garden hoses worth of data cables to a helmet on your head in order to experience virtual reality, but it was super compelling. People did it.
What happened to VPL? I'm assuming based on the fact that I've never heard of VPL, it didn't work because my first real view of virtual reality came with Oculus, which we'll touch on later. What ended up happening to VPL in that era?
Yeah, I mean, it was just way too cumbersome and way too expensive for consumer use. So Lanier raised money. Ultimately, he ended up in bankruptcy in the early 90s. He survived off government contracts for a while. NASA actually adopted some of these technologies to help with some of the ideas of manipulating things in space. By the mid-1980s, he had sold off his last bit of intellectual property, which was this data glove that allowed for gestural interface to Mattel to be used as a toy.
For me, one of the real joys of this podcast is getting this perspective from you on just the historical vantage point of an industry that I would have never really even known. We could sit on Wikipedia and try and find this, but my guess is Wikipedia won't even mention VPL or Timothy Leary experimenting with VR. I guess, why do you even bring that up? Because I know that it does shape your view of virtual reality to today. So why are we even talking about VPL?
I think it's really important because VPL at its core wasn't really a product. It was a bright and shiny idea. It was this poster child for this tech subculture's dreams about the future. I believe that encapsulates a lot of our history with virtual reality since VPL. First, almost everyone's initial experience of VR, that Timothy Leary moment, their first encounter with a VR simulation good enough to be relatively immersive, is just pure and visceral. My own first impressions of virtual reality when I was able later in the 90s and then even in the 2000s and 2010s to encounter virtual reality, it has that effect on you where it's just a wow moment when you first go into a virtual reality experience. And that was true even then at the VPL level, at the earliest days of virtual reality. It has this disorienting quality, this sort of liminal experience. And again, the Timothy Leary connection is not that weird because it does have that religious transcendence experience that you get with psychedelic drugs. Rule number 1 of VR, which is going to remain true throughout the decades, is it gives amazing demo. Number 2, VR plays this role in our art and our culture that's way more comprehensive and aspirational than the role that VR actually plays in our lives and in the tech industry. It's a bit like space travel, I think. It's a good comparison, which is in our artistic culture, we just hand wave all of these inconvenient realities like gravity, life-threatening radiation, the limits of the speed of light, et cetera, because space travel is so cool and it works so well in our storytelling. Most of the business friction that virtual reality has encountered, and man, that business friction has been enormous, has come from that dissonance between the cultural imagination of VR and the often underwhelming reality.
The space travel or just the space analogy is a fun one. And it's not one that I've thought about a lot, but even in my own experience, the first time I tried out Oculus, it was, I think, a DK1 or the developer kit at the time. And I just remember being mind blown. I had never tried any of the other products at the time, but there was just this amazing moment, like you said, that was sort of psychedelic of, where am I? What is going on? Is this the future? And it's hard to sort of feel like it's not the future when you see a glimpse of it. So from my vantage point, I understand why so many people do try and build and work towards this. Given that, VPL presumably fails, what ends up happening next? And how long until we start to see the modern era of where we are?
So it's interesting. The mantle of VR kind of gets picked up by an odd collection of companies, primarily toy companies, after the failure of VPL. So we talked about how Mattel had acquired VPL's technology in the data glove. Hasbro hires a bunch of ex-military people who came out of the simulations world, the Evans and Sutherland world in Utah, to build this VR deck that basically never ships. But they try it in the 1990s. Nintendo licenses this heads-up display from a little Massachusetts company and turns it into this thing called the Virtual Boy, which was this massive commercial failure. It ships in 95, canceled in 96. Sega invests in a head-mounted VR display, but they cancel it again a year later. And they move the technology, interestingly, to their high-end arcade systems, where it's remained viable for many, many years. That's basically where a lot of the interesting consumer VR moved after the death of VPL and the failure of some of these toy company projects, is into the arcade.
Now that you mention it, it makes sense. Like when I was a kid, I remember seeing, obviously, the thing you would put on your head and you get some view of what a virtual reality headset looks like. It's obviously nowhere near the quality that we have today of virtual reality, but it was pretty mind-blowing at the time.
And again, this 90s reemergence of virtual reality as a cultural thing is spawned by a science fiction novel. Just like in 1984, we have Neuromancer and VPL. In the 1990s, we have Neal Stephenson's Snow Crash, which hits the bookshelves in 1992 and is really one of the most important cultural artifacts in the history of the video game business. It's kind of funny that this novel, which is very well known, and Neal Stephenson has remained a very important cultural figure to this day. In fact, he's worked in a variety of futurist roles at various companies, including his recent gig at Magic Leap down in Florida. But he publishes this novel, Snow Crash, and it sets off this wave. It presented a kind of more grounded view of virtual reality than Gibson's Neuromancer. I mean, in Gibson's world, it's this abstracted, geometric view of a world of data that you fly through with your goggles and your haptic gloves. In the Snow Crash novel, it feels more game-like. It feels more like something we would imagine as a virtual world. He also names it, and that name will come back very important to the future of virtual reality. He calls it the metaverse.
We can blame Neal Stephenson for that term that all of us have now heard. If you spend any time in the games or just the technology business, you have heard the term metaverse at this point.
And he's backed away a bit from people who've tried to apply it too literally to our current circumstance. But yeah, he is responsible for it.
So now that you have Snow Crash come out, what happens next? Is there now a bunch of new companies that are popping up based off of the hope of achieving a metaverse?
Well, I think the idea of the metaverse and of Snow Crash to this future of virtual worlds was immediately apparent. And I remember at the time having this conversation with high-level executives in the video game business. They would reference Snow Crash as kind of a metaphor for the development of virtual worlds in boardrooms of games companies. It was that ubiquitous. But like a lot of that first wave of VR in the 80s, this second wave also like crashes on what I'd call the shores of unfulfilled promises. This time it went way beyond just the freaks and geeks of the 80s subculture, and it was really a part of mainstream media. I mean, I remember there's an old show called Murder, She Wrote. It was the quintessential packaged TV of the 1990s, like CBS kind of big network television show. And Angela Lansbury, this little old lady who plays the detective, at one point did an episode where she puts on a virtual reality goggles and gloves and is like flailing around on television. I mean, this was hard to imagine because we think of VR as such a modern thing, but a lot of the same stuff we're seeing today, we saw back in the 90s with this pop cultural adoption of this technology. But of course, like all of this stuff failed. The head-mounted displays, the body sensing input devices, the immersive 3D environments, they really kind of disappeared for probably about a decade after this sort of second wave fails.
So it disappears. And the Murder, She Wrote episode that you're referencing, I think it came out in 1993 when I looked it up, which is actually the year I was born. And so it makes sense that for me, I actually hadn't heard about virtual reality until you actually have the Kickstarter for Oculus start to blow up. And maybe it's just important to just explain what happens in that decade leading up to what eventually becomes Oculus and this new wave that we know today.
So a lot of the energy that had sustained this virtual reality hype ends up getting refocused on 3D virtual worlds and really becomes the domain primarily of games companies. One company that gets a lot of attention during this period is this company called Linden Lab, where I was briefly an independent board member before I joined Benchmark. Linden launches this game Second Life in 2003, and it built up this robust economy around virtual property, which we'll discuss in future episodes. While its success was ultimately very limited, it was nevertheless influential at the time, and a lot of people consider it to be sort of a prototype of the modern idea of the metaverse. This 3D virtual world in which you could live, essentially. You could experience an alternate reality. So by 2010, there were 4 main flavors of these virtual worlds. The massively multiplayer online games like RuneScape and World of Warcraft, the sandbox games like EVE Online, Grand Theft Auto, and Minecraft, kids' virtual worlds like Neopets, Habbo, and Roblox, and social worlds like Second Life and IMVU. These virtual worlds didn't rely on a hardware peripheral like virtual reality did. There was no head-mounted display, so they could be experienced through a conventional computer monitor. They didn't require this immersive, haptic system to make them work. And as a result, they were far more widely adopted. And I think they sort of eased people into the idea of virtual reality by presenting these virtual worlds. And I think that's a really important point, which is that the success of these virtual worlds challenges the core assumption of the prior attempts to do VR. And that is that the platform is somehow this head-mounted display with haptic controllers. That the VR hardware was somehow more than just a high-fidelity peripheral for accessing an immersive software experience. The hardware as platform argument may have made sense in the pre-internet world that was dominated by video game consoles, but the rise of virtual worlds really makes it clear that software is at the center of this revolution.
We've talked about this at length in the past episode, specifically around consoles and how that's started to erode. It's very interesting that we still see so many people jumping into virtual reality and headsets as the platform product when we are clearly starting to see in the console episode that that's already starting to get eroded. From my vantage point, it's pretty shocking how many people are trying to go after this, almost thinking that it's the next mobile phone.
It's really interesting to think about, but if the newest wave of virtual reality had never happened, and we only had the legacy of these previous generations of virtual reality, and we were left with first-person shooters in really immersive 3D environments, and we had these virtual social worlds and all of these other things, we might consider VR a success because it really was the thing that got us moving along this path to the immersive virtual world. It focused all of our attention on this fully realized 3D immersive experience that I think it was an important door open for the game business. And it led to a lot of success commercially and culturally.
The magic of the sandbox games that we talked about in the Playground and Stage episode really are born from this phenomenon of those first 2 generations, sort of paving the way of what's possible.
Yeah, they were successful businesses too. A lot of money was made picking up the remnants of virtual reality and redeploying them in the context of these virtual worlds and 3D shooters. I'd say the revenue and market value generated by virtual world companies far, far exceeds the aggregate value of hardware-enabled virtual reality, including our modern examples of hardware-enabled virtual reality. Unfortunately, hardware VR wasn't dead yet. It was about to resurface again, and the industry was about to revisit this platform versus peripheral debate, but this time with a new generation of players who didn't experience these first 2 waves of VR, and with way bigger stakes.
This is so fascinating to me because I've never heard virtual reality explained through the lens of books. Is it fair to say that the next novel that kicks us off is Ready Player One?
It's very fair to say that. I think, like Neuromancer and Snow Crash before it, Ready Player One explodes onto the pop culture landscape in 2011, and it rekindles popular interest in virtual reality hardware. It's funny because the novel is itself weirdly self-conscious about its nostalgia for the game culture of the 1980s. If you read that novel, the wizard who runs the gaming company at the core of this is obsessed with 80s game culture. And 80s game culture itself had a minor obsession with virtual reality. So it's kind of weirdly self-reflexive that virtual reality comes back in this particular novel as a concept. A lot of that novel takes place in this VR world that's accessed through 80s traditional means of head-mounted displays and haptic body controllers. And Ready Player One becomes kind of a touchstone for this new VR hype cycle, and this time even bigger and crazier than the previous 2.
And it becomes a movie, and it's really sort
A
of
Steven Spielberg movie.
Yeah, exactly. And anyone within the universe of technology and gaming has probably read or knows something about Ready Player One. And I remember the first time I read it, I was like, this is awesome. I also want this thing. But again, I had never even heard about virtual reality before Ready Player One. And that's largely because I wasn't even around during those first two generations of VR. You were obviously skeptical of the first two generations of VR. Ready Player One, kicks off this new wave. You are now investing. Do you look at any of the new VR companies that come with this wave?
Yes, I did. So let me tell you that story. So I first met this guy, Brendan Arib, in 2010 when he was the CEO of this company called Scaleform in Baltimore that made this really specific user interface tool for video games that were delivered on CD-ROMs. Basically, your initial interface that you used to install the CD-ROM was made by this company Scaleform, and everybody licensed it. So although I wasn't interested in investing in this company, we talked about the future of gaming, and I shared my perspective with Brendan that the CD-ROM was probably in decline and that he probably had a short window in which he could sell the business at a premium before it too started to decline. He took my advice and he sold Scaleform to Autodesk in early 2011. And he moves to Southern California and he asks if he can join one of my portfolio companies, the early game streaming company Gaikai, as head of product. So I agree. He comes down, joins the company, is incredibly helpful, and Sony acquires Gaikai in the first half of 2012 after he's been there about a year, and Brendan leaves to go and look for something new. I run into him at E3 that year in LA, and he says that he's found his next thing, and it's a low-cost, potentially mass-market VR headset. And he says he wants to come in and show it to me when he's ready to raise a round. So in September of 2012, he comes to pitch us with his new partner, this doughy teenager named Palmer Luckey, who had invented this VR device in his garage in Long Beach.
I'm so curious to hear how that pitch went or what your experience was at that time.
So this was pre-Kickstarter. At this point, the prototype, what would become the Oculus Rift, was basically a cell phone duct taped into a pair of ski goggles. But their pitch made sense. The high-resolution displays necessary to maintain this illusion of virtual reality in a head-mounted display were now good enough and cheap enough that you could engineer them into a satisfying consumer product. Sensor technologies had gotten a lot better since the 90s. The proliferation of sensors in mobile devices had created economies of scale that would benefit a consumer VR company trying to bring a device to market. But we were primarily consumer software investors, and this was a consumer electronics pitch. We weren't typically hardware investors, and so we passed.
I'm curious to get your perspective today. How do you feel about passing on Oculus?
I think it was a classic case of what we at Benchmark like to call wrong for the right reasons. Look, in the intervening decade, VR has not worked as a business, clearly. I mean, despite the efforts of big companies, massive companies, and many small startups, had Oculus been forced to stand on its own as an independent company and not get acquired by Facebook, it very likely would have suffered the fate of all the other artificial reality hardware companies of the past and the present, like Magic Leap. Look, I underestimated the incredible allure of the VR fantasy. There was a reason that the Oculus management team gave every new employee a copy of Ready Player One. They were selling the dream. I was just not sure there wasn't going to be anybody to buy the dream, and that's where I was totally wrong.
How quickly after you pass do you realize, oh my gosh, this dream is going to really catch on like wildfire?
So Brendan does a successful Kickstarter and crowdfunds the Oculus developer kits, and he raises Oculus's first venture round in the spring of 2013. By late 2013, they had delivered their second generation device that they had codenamed Crescent Bay. And that was really where it took off because at that point, they could give an amazing demo. And I went down and saw the Crescent Bay demo. It was remarkable. So armed with these good demos and a ton of hype, they landed a big investment from Andreessen Horowitz. And I think this was the magic ingredient. And I think this was something that we weren't in a position to necessarily supply to an Oculus as an investor. Mark Andreessen, who sat on the board at Facebook, immediately started putting the bug in Mark Zuckerberg's ear that Oculus was the next big thing.
We know how this ends, where Facebook acquires Oculus. And today we now know Facebook has rebranded as Meta, sort of all in on this strategy. What do you think was the frame of mind of Facebook at the time for that acquisition? And maybe just a little glimpse of like how they might be thinking about it today.
Interestingly, in the spring of 2014, just a few days before the Game Developers Conference, Zuckerberg calls my partner, Matt Kohler, and asks for a meeting with me and Matt at the Facebook offices. So he and I drive down there and we hang out with Mark Zuckerberg in his office at Facebook for like an hour and a half discussing wearable technology and the Arduino and the Raspberry Pi. Like we were on this just a frolic and a detour through a whole bunch of portable and wearable technologies of the day. But toward the end of the conversation, he gets around to asking me what my opinion is about VR and Oculus. And I shared my opinion, which is that I thought VR was not going to really work as a consumer electronic in the market, that it was basically a peripheral and that it wasn't a platform. Zuck just waves off my skepticism and he says, I think that VR is potentially the next iPhone-sized consumer platform. A few days later, Facebook acquires Oculus for $2.3 billion plus retention incentives. So look, you know how this worked out. At the time, I don't think this is as true today, but at the time, Facebook was considered smart money. And so Facebook's acquisition of Oculus just sets off this tsunami of FOMO in the consumer electronics industry. HTC, Valve, Samsung, Google, Sony, Microsoft, they all announce entry into the hardware market for head-mounted displays and controllers. But look, with the big company involvement came big company public relations and big company expectations, and what my partner Bill Gurley likes to call big company orchestration, which is that the actual use of the technology doesn't end up getting explored and developed by end users. It has to be what the companies imagine it to be. So they start propagating their own idea of virtual reality, and it doesn't really line up with the reality of what the device is capable of.
It's interesting because as you say this, it's actually Facebook's acquisition sort of starts like the fourth wave, or the modern wave of where we are today, where everyone sort of looks at Facebook and they're like, they're investing billions of dollars into virtual reality in the metaverse. Like, that must be a thing. And you've obviously seen, there were VR-specific funds that launched during that period. And it's really kickstarted. Even to this day, you still see so many people building on virtual reality, almost in blind faith that Facebook knows what they're doing.
Yeah, I always subscribe to the William Gibson aphorism that the street finds its own uses for things. I think that's really important in the venture business. The intentions of the hardware manufacturers just don't always match what the consumers want to do with the thing when those consumers bring that thing into their lives. Look, I looked at Twitter when it was a two-person company being operated out of another company in South Park in San Francisco back in 2007. And what Jack Dorsey had imagined Twitter to be was a one-to-many dispatch system, which he conceived of when he was a bicycle messenger in New York City. So is that what we think of as Twitter today? No, the street found its own use for the thing, and the street was allowed to find that use, and the company leaned into that use. And that's the dialogue between startups and their customers, which can often lead to better and better products. That was never allowed to happen in this latest wave of VR because, again, as you say, Facebook was considered such smart money that when they made this investment, everybody else was like, oh my God forbid Facebook should seize the high ground here and invent the new iPhone. So now we're almost a decade into this fourth wave of virtual reality. It's cost tens of billions of dollars from corporate treasuries and venture capital funds invested and lost during that period, funding devices, applications, et cetera, et cetera. None of the competitors have unseated Facebook, but Facebook itself has failed to really deliver on the initial promise of this technology. I spoke at the Casual Connect conference back in 2016, and I got asked about virtual reality, and I compared the development of the VR market to the mobile games business, where we first saw the commercial experimentation around 1999. We talked about it in the mobile gaming episode in Japan. iMode had their release in 1999, but it wasn't until 2009 when the iPhone releases in-app purchase that it was a real business driven forward throughout that decade by massive global demand for mobile communication. So we had this underlying wave of need for mobile phones, and it still took a decade. There wasn't anything remotely like this in the VR context. There was no underlying need driving VR into people's homes. It was always kind of a curiosity. And to tell you the truth, I vastly underestimated how long it would take VR to find a market. I wasn't really convinced that VR would get to mobile phone scale, but I was kind of convinced that it could have gotten to game console scale. And I was even wrong about that.
I think you touched on something that's really important just there, which is that phones really did have an underlying utility, which was mobile communication. And VR, like you said, really doesn't have that exact problem or that it's solving for. It's sort of this solution that is in search of a problem, if you want to use the VC terminology. But it's really sort of a novelty, even to this day. I own an Oculus, and I can't tell you the last time that I've put on my Oculus. And when I do, it's usually I have friends over and they want to try it because they're like, what is this thing?
Yeah, it's interesting. And it's part of the reason I think why, if you read interviews with Zuckerberg to this day, he always talks about VR as a communications technology. He always runs from comparisons to the game business and other things like that, and is always like, no, this is the future of communications, because I think he recognizes that it requires that kind of pull to get into the consumer mentality. And interestingly enough, look, as usual with these sorts of things, it's the game industry that figures out the use for it. I mean, I would argue that probably the most successful implementation of VR commercially during this period has been Sony, who built a really good head-mounted display, linked it to the PlayStation, which was already a really high-performance computing device, and offered software that made good use of it.
When you said that maybe the console is the best comp for it, or at least that's what you had thought at the time, that's sort of where my head is even today, is that maybe, best case of VR is that it does look like the next console. And we just spent an hour in the previous episode talking about how consoles are probably going to be eroded, or just their place within the gaming ecosystem is sort of just stale. It's interesting to just think about what that means for VR headsets or just VR in general.
In that episode, in the console episode, even though we did talk about the fact that consoles aren't really a big growth industry or a highly dynamic laboratory of business model experimentation, it's still a big business, the console business. And you could not say that about VR after this first decade. So Oculus's head of content, former EA exec Mike Verdu, announces in the summer of 2022 that 60 VR titles had achieved 1 million or more in gross revenues, which sounds like momentum, right? That actually sounds pretty good. But when you parse it with games priced between $20 and $40, you could get to $1 million in revenue selling 25 to 50,000 units, which is nothing. It's like a day's mobile phone downloads for a really hot title.
If you probably looked at the concurrence for some of these, it would be quite low, which is the metric that sort of the gaming industry has now moved on to, which is how many people are actually playing this game at the exact same time.
The rhythm-based game Beat Saber, which is arguably a masterful implementation of virtual reality, is the one legitimate Oculus hit. It sold millions and millions of units, probably penetrating a high percentage of the active installed base. I've called it previously the mist of virtual reality, because back in the 80s, when people were trying to get the CD-ROM adopted, and you'd go into a computer store and they would try and sell you a CD-ROM. If you asked them, what do I do with it? They'd hand you a copy of Myst. And in a lot of ways, that's the same thing that's happened with VR with Beat Saber. It's kind of the standout product that allows a noob to understand what the potential of the technology is. But that's it. That's the hit.
There's something funny around the best performing thing for Oculus. The best selling application is actually a game. And given that we're a games podcast, it's just, there's something interesting that despite Mark Zuckerberg talking about this being a communication platform, it seems like the clearest product market fit so far has actually been a game.
Or a game peripheral, certainly. And look, it hadn't even been that successful as a peripheral. They've only sold about 20 million units of the higher end Oculus. That's really not that much more than consumer drone sales, which in a lot of ways are the previous generations I like to call sock drawer wear. The thing you get for Christmas, you play with for a couple months, and then you stick in a sock drawer. In a lot of ways, virtual reality headsets have become that kind of a device in modern capitalism.
Yeah, look at the Oculus app installs on the day after Christmas. If anyone ever does that, where you look at the App Store, Oculus will always be almost number one, or very close to number one. And it might just be the sock drawer peripheral that you had mentioned.
But I want to get back to the point you made before that, which is the relevance of VR in being related to games, because I think that's just crucial. And it's crucial in particular because of the success that the games industry had throughout the 2000s with virtual worlds. We talked about the Second Life management team in a previous episode and how they had this aversion to the games business. They wouldn't even let me use the word game in the boardroom. And in a lot of ways, Facebook has a similar kind of antipathy toward the games business. For all these lessons that we've learned in the games business in 2 decades of virtual world development and refinement, it feels like all of those lessons are somewhat lost on Facebook's current implementation. The version of Horizon Worlds that we currently have, it's their flagship virtual reality collaboration and social space. It sucks so badly that even the people who are making it won't use it. A disappointed John Carmack has even left the company, and Carmack has devoted most of his professional career to building virtual reality experiences, whether they were in the context of first-person shooters or in his role as an engineer at Oculus.
Yeah, I can't help but feel like there's a recurring theme throughout these episodes, which is that the technology giants, Meta in this case, sort of just overlook gaming. In a part of me just thinks like a lot of these things can be solved, not overnight, but a lot of their perspective can change just purely off of playing games. And it seems like a lot of the executive teams at these major companies just aren't really games people.
It's very, very true. Well, it's going to be very interesting to see where this goes. Facebook is coming under increasing pressure from Wall Street, particularly in this recession-fearing environment that we're currently in, where stock prices are depressed and people are cost-cutting. There's lots of layoffs happening throughout the tech industry. I think there's scrutiny now being placed on Zuckerberg's folly, if you will, with this hyper investment in virtual reality that had never really been the case before. I think he'd gotten a free pass for most of the last 7 or 8 years with regard to this Oculus investment. And now I think it's coming under much greater scrutiny. Like, what is this supposed to be? And how is this supposed to return value to shareholders? And so it'll be really interesting to see what happens. Maybe it causes them to really find product market fit, or maybe it causes them to pull back sharply on their spending on virtual reality and reposition around some of their core businesses in advertising and social networking that really got them to where they are today. And I think there's another major product launch that's on the horizon. Probably sometime after this podcast gets released, Apple is going to bring a headset to market, which they're calling the Reality Pro. Early indications from those who've seen it, and you and I have talked to some former engineers who've at least given us a hint of what to expect. It seems like it's going to be pretty amazing. A mixed reality device, AR and VR. And Apple has a history of entering these markets that are semi-mature. Let's call it whether it was the PC market spawned by IBM, but which they really took to a new level with the mouse interface and a lot of the other visual computing interfaces that they pioneered. And of course, the mobile phone, where they entered a smartphone market that was highly fragmented and had a lot of really clunky devices, and they just crushed it with a single product, the iPhone. They may be in a position to do something similar in this market. The only thing that gives me some pause is that they're coming to market at a price point that's rumored to be somewhere between $2,500 and $3,500 for the initial units, which is something like 5 times the price of the high-end Oculus.
Apple is sort of doing a masterclass on how to take on a competitor here, where one, they went after their advertising business on the targeting side for Meta, and now it's sort of like a 1-2 punch of now we're actually going to come after this other hardware business that you seemingly invested all this money into. And it will be really interesting to see how that plays out for Apple. I guess for you, given that even today you were still skeptical of VR on some level, why do you think Apple's making the jump into this space?
I think partly defensively. Frankly, they're not betting the company on this. If their virtual reality headset stalls out on launch and fails, they've had products like this before. I mean, the Newton, for example. It's an opportunity to do R&D to the extent that virtual reality would have caught fire with the public. They wanted to be in position to take advantage of it and to have their own entry into that market. I think they have some interesting positioning around the way that the iPhone functions in your life, which could potentially translate into a virtual reality or at least an augmented reality context. And so it's not insane to think that Apple could make a splash in this market. But look, at a $3,000 price point, this is going to be a rich man's toy. At Casual Connect back in 2016, I did mention that I was keeping an eye on the Chinese market because I believe that that might be an interesting, fertile market for virtual reality headsets. And my theory at the time was that because of the cramped living spaces and the like, that virtual reality headsets might function really as a replacement for big screen TVs in that market. that they would be primarily consumption devices rather than interactive devices, that they would be about a way to watch movies in an immersive way, for example, rather than as a way to explore virtual worlds. It sort of sounds like in some of Apple's pre-launch marketing around this Reality Pro, they're adopting kind of a similar bit of rhetoric. And I wonder if that is what an intended use of this is, that it is actually primarily expected to be a consumption device rather than a communication or a traditional VR device.
Historically, when Apple releases these products, it does unlock some new gaming angle. And so I'm curious to see what that means for the gaming industry and how many people try and flock, even at a $3,000 price point. I think they're saying they're targeting 1 million units sold. There will still be interesting use cases that might emerge there. And I'm just curious to see what that plays out to be.
I think you'd have to be a pretty intrepid developer to wade into a hardware market where there's only 1 million unit installed base. And I'm not sure that that's going to match up that well. The Apple developer community is very robust and has a history of early adoption of new devices. The Apple Watch had a robust app environment pretty early on. The iPhone, as soon as they opened the App Store and in-app purchase, there was an explosion of software built by third parties. So it could happen, but they're going to have to do this in dialogue with those developers in the sense that the developers are going to have to be convinced that there's a roadmap that leads from that $3,000 product to a $300 product at some point in the future, because otherwise making that software investment against that tiny installed base is a dubious proposition at best for a software maker. But I do think that this software thing is really something to pull a thread on. And that is, we talked before about virtual worlds emerging from the last wave of VR investment in the 90s, and that VR in a lot of ways contributed to the virtual worlds that arose after it in software. And I think a similar phenomenon may be happening around us right now, which is it's a buzzword and we're going to have to unpack it to a certain extent, but the metaverse as a concept has arisen really in conjunction with this investment around virtual reality that we've seen lately. And I think it's worth talking a little bit about the metaverse as potentially a next step in the evolution of virtual worlds.
There's a big question of, is this the orchestrated PR that you had mentioned, Bill had jokingly said before, or is this, a real thing? And so I think it is worth unpacking what the metaverse even means.
Yeah, to that point, I recently read Matthew Ball's book, The Metaverse, and I was struck by just how much corporate PR stood in for content in that book. I mean, every CEO seems to be having a metaverse strategy in Ball's book, from NVIDIA to games companies to Facebooks to consumer electronics companies. Everybody's positioning themselves as a play in the metaverse. I mean, I've seen my bank tell me they want to be my bank in the metaverse, whatever the hell that means. I mean, I'm not even sure banks will exist in the metaverse, but to the extent they do, my bank wants to be my bank in the metaverse. And when you see stuff like that happening, you know that the rhetoric is kind of getting out in front of reality to a large degree. But that said, I do think that there are some core concepts that are interesting and sensible and worth really thinking about, because I don't think it's entirely impossible that regardless of what happens with VR hardware, some kind of larger investment environment for virtual worlds emerges.
When you say that, what do you think of when you hear the term metaverse? Like, what does that actually even mean?
So let's use Ball's definition, because I think it's actually a useful starting point, and I do think he gets the definition pretty much right in his book. He identifies 6 attributes of the metaverse, at least in my reading of it. And those would include 1, massive scale, 2, interoperability, 3, concurrency, 4, real-time 3D graphics, 5, identity and presence, and 6, a persistent virtual environment. So if you have those 6 things, that's the metaverse to him. I think what's interesting about Ball's definition is that he doesn't require hardware-enabled virtual reality as one of those pillars. He imagines you could get to the metaverse without VR, which I think is a very sensible position. Now, he sees VR as just one of these, let's call them views of the metaverse, but not necessarily the privileged view of the metaverse. And so I think that's a useful way of thinking about the metaverse, in my opinion. What's interesting about Ball's definition is how many of his attributes are the competitive domain of video game companies, and to a lesser extent, social networks. I mean, successful video game companies already deal with concurrency and presence. Massively multiplayer online games have a long history with persistent worlds. And real-time 3D graphics is a space dominated by game-tested technologies like Unreal and Unity running on top of hardware from early game pioneers like NVIDIA. Social networking companies like Facebook and Instagram, TikTok and Twitter and Snap have invested in infrastructure that can handle massive user scale, global user scale, and have all dealt with the complex human problems of online identity in various ways. So I do think there are some companies poised to benefit from this. But I think the clearly open problem in Ball's formulation is this idea of interoperability. And I think this idea of interoperability is key because without interoperability, you have a bunch of standalone, massively multiplayer game-like experiences. What makes it a metaverse, I think, in Ball's definition and the popular imagination, is that it's some kind of continuous space where you can move from experience to experience with a degree of continuity and persistence that, frankly, doesn't exist in our modern imagination of online games.
It's funny for me because when you say the attributes that Matthew Ball mentions describe a metaverse, when you pair that with the forever game traits that we talk about in episode 4, it just feels like it really can pair nicely as a game. And my vantage point has always been that games are far closer to the metaverse than anything else.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that this idea of interoperability is going to be a real challenge over the next decade because these companies are not used to working together in this way. You know, in Ball's book, he describes this interoperability, I think somewhat naively, as inevitable. And he points to the way that the internet protocols like TCP/IP, DNS, and HTML grew out of this need for a kind of common networking platform on which these consumer-facing applications could be built. I don't think that's the way that the interoperability is imagined in the context of the metaverse. I think in this metaverse concept, interoperability exists more at the application layer. And I think that is a much harder nut to crack than getting a bunch of disparate companies to agree on kind of a common low-level networking and transport protocol. I think at its most nefarious, probably the way that Facebook envisions it, this interoperability is something like a suburban shopping mall where a company's infrastructure investment in real estate here is recouped through user capture and through rent seeking of third parties on some kind of a platform. And I think that's, again, how Zuckerberg sees the iPhone. I don't know that that's how other people see the iPhone, but I think that's how he sees the iPhone.
I can't help but feel like these dynamics feel really similar to what we discussed in this previous episode around the consoles, and specifically the way you just framed that around the suburban shopping mall and the rent-seeking side of it. It almost sounds like you're describing Sony and their recoups that they were doing with Fortnite when it came to cross-platform. And I just wonder if we're going to enter a similar dynamic here.
I think it's the nature of walled gardens to utilize that kind of an approach because they always view their investment in the infrastructure as being a recoupable sunk cost. And so they always end up in these rent-seeking relationships with their third parties. Again, I think you could make the argument, and I think people have made the argument, that apps made the iPhone and that it was third parties who built basically the reason for being that allowed the iPhone to reach billion unit scale. That if we had only been stuck with that initial single page of applications that the iPhone launched with back at its origin in 2007, when, you know, it was telephony and a browser and contacts and a calendar, we would never have reached this sort of multi-billion user global scale for smartphones, that it was actually the third parties themselves and their intellectual property contribution to the platform that allowed the platform to actually achieve its true potential and scale. And it's funny how the platform makers never think that way. They always think it was them and that the third parties are just free riding on their infrastructure investment.
Yeah, it's why this Epic versus Apple lawsuit is just so interesting to watch because we've just seen so much data and really Epic is sort of fighting the good fight to try and prove how much value they can provide and try and clean up the App Store in a lot of ways.
Yeah, you know me. We've had a lot of time to talk about these things over the years, and you know that I can be cynical about the motivations of big companies and I can be cynical about the motivations of venture capitalists. And there's certainly a cynical take on this metaverse thing that it's just the last in a long line of overhyped, underdelivered technology fantasies akin to self-driving car boom or the professional esports boom or some of these other things you and I have encountered together in the years that we've known each other. A bunch of companies heavily promoting this metaverse thing. Facebook, Nvidia, Microsoft, Epic, Unity are all over this. These are also the companies that were pimping virtual reality just a couple of years ago. And so you could see this whole metaverse concept as kind of a face-saving gesture by the people who've got their hands dirty in VR saying, hey, look, we weren't totally wrong. But maybe I'm a utopian or an optimist here, but I like to think that the metaverse could actually be more than that. You know, it's funny, when you think about it, all three of the science fiction novels that we've talked about that imagine the metaverse, Neuromancer, Snow Crash, Ready Player One, not to mention other ones that we haven't talked about, like John Brunner's Shockwave Rider, or one that was really interesting to me when I was a kid, Werner Vinge's True Names and Other Dangers. They didn't conceive of this as a utopian environment. They conceived of it as very much a dystopian environment. So while Zuckerberg likes to describe the metaverse as this kind of technology of freedom and this enhancer to human communication, really the metaverse as it's conceived in fiction has been this kind of land of lotus eaters lulled into this sleep in this post-capitalist dystopia where power and social control and exploitation have migrated from the physical world to the online world. And given how much we know about the internet and how much we know about society and how much we've seen the emergence of these comic book villains like Elon Musk, I mean, which outcome do we really think is more likely? The utopian vision of a kind of connected world and happy communication where we can all live together in these online 3D spaces, or something that looks more like the dystopia of science fiction?
I think it's fairly clear where things might head. I think most people are very fearful and hyper aware. Like there's people today that are like, I don't want to have an Oculus because it is tied to Facebook and they know that there's going to be a walled garden again. And I think it's very wishful thinking if you believe that this is going to be fully open in the future.
Yeah, I think the good news here is that it's going to be a boon to the games companies because it's going to spur more and more investment. I think the kinds of infrastructure that games companies rely on, like investment in 3D chip technology at the GPU level in computers and consoles, in phones, et cetera, are all going to get better and better, at least in pursuit of this dream. And I think that augurs really well for the success of games companies moving into the future. And I'm really happy about that aspect of all of this attention being paid to the metaverse. So at least I think we could take that away as a hopeful sign from this episode. Look, I think all of that R&D that we're doing around virtual worlds and around this concept of interoperability, whether or not it leads to this kind of fully open, fully exchangeable metaverse, it's going to have interesting implications in the games world. We're going to see new virtual worlds and new massively multiplayer online games that are going to borrow from these concepts. And I think it's going to be really, really cool. So whether we get to this massive globe-spanning metaverse of our dreams, I think it's going to be a good news for the video game business in general, and I think it's going to spawn some real creativity in the business. And frankly, one of the places it's going to spawn some of the most creativity is around commercial life in these games, something we're going to explore in the next episode where we talk about in-game economies and how virtual economies have developed over that same period of time.
The final episode.
Looking forward to it.